Late November in Chicago weighed heavily with gray skies. The skyscrapers along Michigan Avenue loomed like silent giants, their golden lights spilling onto the rain-soaked pavement, blurring into hazy streaks. The wind swept fiercely through, carrying the damp chill of a city that had never been kind to low-income people. Julia Thompson pulled her worn, thin coat tighter around herself. She had just finished a long day teaching at an elementary school on the outskirts of town. A teacher's salary was meager, but for her it wasn't just a job, it was comfort. A reason to rise each morning and face those innocent eyes that still believed the world outside was full of hope. Yet at this very moment, Julia found that faith hard to hold on to. She had just received notice that her rent was going up again. The cold numbers on white paper felt like shackles dragging her deeper into debt and worry. Just hold on a little longer, Julia told herself, hurrying toward the bus stop. But the last bus had already left, abandoning her on the deserted street. Raindrops began tapping against the tin roofs, then grew heavier, lashing her face, washing away the faint makeup she had tried to preserve after a long day. She bit her lip, bracing for a nearly 10-block walk in the cold rain. Chicago's streets at night were never welcoming, least of all the dark alleys, where blaring horns mixed with shouts of arguments and sometimes the distant crack of gunfire. Julia heard something else through that jumble of city noise, a cry. Not the whiny, exaggerated sobs of children in her classroom, but a trembling, broken sound, like muffled sobbing, forced into silence. It came from a narrow alley beside an old convenience store that had been closed for a long time. Julia froze. Instinct urged her to keep walking. "Don't get involved," reason whispered. But 8 years of calming students, soothing tears over bad grades or bruises that came from nowhere had ingrained a different reflex in her. When a child cries, she must go to them. Julia stepped into the alley. The rain lashed harder, the wind howled through shattered windows. And there, under the weak yellow glow of a flickering street lamp, she saw a small figure curled up beside a trash bin. A boy, no older than 7. His clothes were soaked through his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and yet his eyes bright blue, gleaming even through tears lifted to meet hers. They struck Julia like shards of ice piercing her chest. "What are you doing here all alone?" Julia asked gently, kneeling, softening her voice as much as possible. The boy flinched, drawing back, but then his lips trembled as he whispered, I got lost. Evil men. They were chasing Papa. I ran. And then I couldn't find Papa anymore." The words chilled Julia to the bone. A child speaking of evil men chasing his father with such raw truth, it was heartbreaking. "What's your name?" Julia asked, holding out her hand softly. "Ethan. Ethan Smith." The boy sniffled. The name rang faintly familiar, but Julia didn't think further at that moment. She shrugged off her coat, wrapping it around his shivering body. "Come on, I'll take you home. It's warmer there." He hesitated, wary, but at last let Julia take his hand. His tiny palm was ice cold, clinging to hers, as though she were the only lifeline left. Julia's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building with peeling walls and hallways that reeked of mildew. But inside she had tried to craft a different world: shelves cobbled from crates, children's drawings taped to the walls, and a small desk lamp casting a warm yellow glow. She hurried to fetch towels and rummaged for oversized clothes to slip onto Ethan. Seeing the boy swallowed in a sweater that reached his knees made Julia's nose sting with sudden emotion. After a bowl of hot soup, Ethan stopped shivering. He glanced around the tiny apartment with curiosity before asking quietly, "Are you really a teacher?" Julia smiled, nodding. "Yes, I teach 3rd grade. Papa says, teachers are the keepers of the keys to knowledge." Ethan murmured with a strangely mature tone for his age. Julia paused. This boy was unlike any of her students. His gaze carried depths far beyond his years. When she asked for his father's phone number, Ethan shook his head firmly. "You can't call the police. Papa said so. Some evil people want to hurt him." A shiver ran down Julia's spine. Every instinct told her she had stumbled into something dangerous. But looking at his small, tear-streaked face, she knew she couldn't turn away. Night deepened. Julia lay Ethan on the sofa, tucking him in with her grandmother's old quilt. Outside, rain still beat against the glass, the streetlights flickering as though trying to send a warning. Just as Julia convinced herself that tomorrow she would find a way to contact his family, the low hum of engines rose outside. She pulled back the curtain cautiously. 3 sleek black cars had stopped silently in front of the building. Headlights dimmed engines, idling softly like predators waiting. Julia's breath caught in her throat. From the middle car, a tall figure emerged. Even through the pouring rain, his presence commanded attention. His cold blue eyes glinted in the darkness, his stern face marked by a long scar across his temple. 3 heavy knocks rattled her window. Ethan stirred awake, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Papa?" Julia froze. She had taken in a lost child. But his father, the man who appeared out of the stormy Chicago night, was no ordinary man. He was Jacob Smith. A name that by the next morning, when Julia searched it online, would send ice flooding through her veins, one of Chicago's most mysterious billionaires rumored to hold the reins of the city's shadow networks. The rain outside poured harder, like a curtain shrouding the secret that was about to drag Julia into an inescapable storm. Sometimes a single decision like stopping for a child's cry on a rainy night can alter an entire life. Do you think Julia should have opened that door, or should she have run from Jacob's world the moment she had the chance? If this story has sparked your curiosity, stay tuned for the following chapters where love, danger, and secrets intertwine, leading Julia toward her fateful crossroads. The knocking came again, louder and more insistent. Julia froze in the middle of her tiny apartment, her hands instinctively clasping together. Her heart pounded not only from fear, but also from the unshakable intuition that this moment would change her life forever. Little Ethan sat upright on the sofa, still wrapped in the old quilt, his blue eyes gleaming in the yellow light. Unlike Julia's panic, he whispered with a calm certainty, "Papa." That single word froze the room. Julia stared at the flimsy wooden door behind which strangers patiently waited. Outside, the rain mingled with the steady rumble of idling engines, a dirge at night. Julia took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "Ethan, are you sure it's your father?" The boy nodded, eyes wide and unwavering, brimming with trust. Julia moved toward the door, torn inside. A part of her wanted to lock it tight, pretend none of this was happening. But Ethan's gaze, filled with both hope and fear, left her no choice. Her hand rested on the latch. The cold metal seeped into her skin, sending a shiver through her body. She turned the lock. The door swung open, and the man stepped inside. Jacob Smith entered like a shadow made flesh. His charcoal gray tailored suit clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, each step heavy enough to make the old wooden floorboards groan. The thin scar along his left temple caught the dim light, not diminishing his striking looks, but sharpening the dangerous aura around him. Julia instinctively stepped back. On the other hand, Ethan leapt into his father's arms with a cry of relief. "Papa!" The boy buried his face into his father's chest, sobs breaking free. Jacob bent down his arms, enveloping his son with unexpected tenderness. His large hand stroked Ethan's damp hair, and for a fleeting moment, the icy blue of his eyes softened with a rare, gentle glow. "My boy." His voice was low, hoarse, carrying both worry and relief. "Are you hurt?" Ethan shook his head, then pointed toward Julia. "She saved me." Jacob lifted his gaze. His eyes locked on Julia's, a stare sharp as a blade, probing, commanding, impossible to look away from. Julia's body stiffened, heat rising to her cheeks under the weight of his scrutiny. In that moment, the room shrank until only the pounding of her heartbeat remained. "You are—" Jacob spoke, his tone that of a man born to command, though tinged with curiosity. "Julia Thompson." She answered, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I found Ethan on the street in the rain." Jacob nodded slightly, his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary, as if measuring something unseen. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick wad of bills, and set it on the table. "Thank you for helping my son. This is your rightful reward." Julia glanced at the money, then lifted her chin, her eyes firm. "I don't want your money." A flicker of surprise crossed his cold features. Few in this city ever refused Jacob Smith's money. Why? His voice was quiet but carried the weight of demand. Julia inhaled deeply. Because this wasn't a transaction. It was a child. He needs safety, not a price tag. Silence fell. In the dim yellow light, something stirred in Jacob's gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. At last, he tucked the money away and slipped a plain white card into Julia's hand. "If you ever need anything, anytime, call me." His fingers brushed hers warm, yet the contact sent a jolt through her like an electric shock. The apartment felt strangely hollow when Jacob left with Ethan and his guards. Julia collapsed onto a chair, her hands still trembling. The card remained in her palm, embossed with simple letters. Jacob Smith, a single phone number. No title, no address. The name tugged at her memory. Snippets of news whispered rumors in a corner cafe. A man both enigmatic and infamous. In Chicago's media, he was whispered about with half-truth nicknames real estate tycoon mafia's invisible hand. Julia shivered. 2 weeks later, she tried to return to routine teaching, grading spelling tests, tending to her students. But in her mind, those piercing blue eyes never left her. One afternoon, as she was tidying up her classroom, the school secretary delivered a bouquet of pristine white roses with a card tucked inside Julia Thompson. "I want to see you. 7 p.m., Venetian Room, Fairmont Hotel. J.S." Julia's hands trembled. The brief note initials clipped like a command struck her with dread and intrigue. She knew what she should do: toss the roses, tear the card, forget everything. But another voice inside her whispered low and insistent. What does he want from me? The Fairmont Hotel that night. The grand lobby shimmered beneath chandeliers, the sound of a piano drifting through the air. Julia stepped inside her simple black dress, accentuating her figure. She felt out of place among women glittering with diamonds, yet held her head high. The Venetian Room glowed in soft light. Jacob was already seated at the far table by the window, the city sprawling behind him in glass and steel. He rose as she entered, an unexpectedly polite gesture, contrasting his dangerous aura. "You came." His voice, low and resonant, vibrated in Julia's chest like music. She sat across from him, her eyes never leaving his sharply handsome face. "Why did you invite me here?" Jacob leaned forward, his gaze cutting deep. "Because I want to know. Why you took my son home instead of leaving him on the street or calling the police." Julia blinked in surprise, then gave a faint, bitter smile. "Because he's a child. No one deserves to be abandoned in the rain." For a fleeting moment, Jacob's eyes softened. But then they sharpened again, colder than ever. "Do you realize how dangerous that made things for you?" His voice was like a warning. "Some people follow me. And now, they will follow you too." Julia's breath caught. In that instant, she understood she had entered another world, where laws weren't written on paper, but carved in blood and power. Jacob Smith's world. And she knew the path out would never be easy. The light in the Venetian Room stretched like strands of golden silk, falling across the table, draped in immaculate white linen. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, filling the space with brilliance, yet they could not dispel the heaviness that clung to the air. Julia sat across from Jacob Smith, her hands resting tensely on her lap as she tried to conceal her unease. The man before her seemed utterly unconcerned by the glances of others in the restaurant. Reclining slightly in his chair, one hand loosely holding a glass of wine, he radiated such composure that anyone facing him felt on the verge of faltering. "Do you drink wine?" Jacob asked, his velvet deep voice rolling effortlessly, carrying the cadence of command, even when phrased as a question. Julia hesitated. Fine wine was foreign to her, but declining outright seemed too conspicuous. At last, she gave a slight nod. The waiter poured a dark red liquid into her glass, shimmering like blood beneath the dim light. "I still don't understand," Julia said, her voice slightly hoarse with tension. "Why do you care that I helped Ethan? A man like you. Surely he has countless ways to protect his son." Jacob raised his eyes. That icy, yet lit with something indefinable look stripped her bare, as though he could see every weakness she tried to hide. "Most people focus on motives," he said slowly. "I care about essence. Most would walk past a lost child in the rain, or call the police. But you brought him home." Julia bit her lip. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. It was just instinct." "Instinct speaks louder than words," Jacob murmured, the corner of his mouth curving faintly. "And yours intrigues me." Julia felt the undercurrent in his tone. That intrigue was not idle curiosity, it was a test. A probing choice, perhaps even a veiled warning. The courses arrived, intricate, meticulously plated Italian dishes. Julia glanced at the gleaming silverware knives, polished like mirrors, and felt like an intruder in a world of grandeur to which she did not belong. Jacob noticed her discomfort, the faint smile returning to his lips. "Don't let these rituals trouble you. Eat as you wish." Julia set down the utensils and quietly lifted her glass of water instead of wine. "You brought me here to see how I would behave in your world." "Partly," Jacob replied curtly. "And the other part?" For a moment he was silent, swirling the glass of red wine so that the liquid danced. Then he looked up, his blue eyes shadowed with a quiet sorrow. "Ethan needs someone. Someone who understands children. Someone he can trust. I could hire dozens of skilled tutors, but none can make him smile like he does when he's with you." Julia froze. His words pierced her heart. The image of Ethan clinging to her, his bright eyes laced with fear, flashed before her. "You mean you want me to become Ethan's private tutor?" she asked carefully. Jacob nodded. 3 sessions a week. I will pay enough to erase your student loans and give you a comfortable life." Julia clenched her hands. A part of her wanted to refuse immediately. Yet another part, the part that thought of Ethan, hesitated, her heart trembling. "Why me?" Julia whispered, her voice low, as though to steady its tremor. Jacob held her gaze. "Because you are different." The air stilled. In his eyes, Julia glimpsed something beyond calculation and power, a simple yearning, the plea of a father, searching for an anchor for his child. The dinner continued, though Julia barely tasted the food. Jacob spoke of trust, loyalty, and responsibility. He never mentioned his work, but every word carried hidden shadows Julia dared not explore. At one point, he spoke of his late wife. His voice sank, his gaze drifting far away. "She was the light in a house filled with darkness. When she died, both Ethan and I lost our compass." Julia felt the ache that weighed upon him, not paraded for sympathy, but carved deep and permanent. In that instant, she realized Jacob was not merely a name tied to wealth and power. He was also a man carrying wounds that would never fully heal. When the dinner ended, Jacob rose and courteously pulled out her chair. Together, they stepped into the grand lobby. A sleek black limousine waited at the curb. The driver opened the back door, but Jacob didn't enter immediately. Instead, he turned to Julia, his gaze sharp, yet softened by something else. "Think carefully about my offer," he said. "This is not just a job, it is a choice." Julia pressed her lips together. "And if I refuse?" Jacob leaned closer, his face only inches from hers, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Then I will still find a way to protect you. But it will no longer be easy." A chill ran through Julia. It wasn't a threat. It was a stark truth. Jacob stepped into the car, the door closing with quiet finality. The limousine slipped into the Chicago night, leaving Julia alone on the hotel steps, surrounded by the glitter of gowns and laughter. That night, Julia lay awake in her modest apartment, staring at the business card on the table as if it glowed in the dark. She knew one phone call would change her life forever. The question gnawed at her relentlessly. Was this an opportunity or a trap outside Chicago? Roared on, sleepless as always, but a small flame had been kindled within Julia's heart, fueled by curiosity, unease, and something even more dangerous, a feeling she dared not yet name. The road leading to the Smith estate stretched along Lake Michigan. On that December afternoon, the sky was veiled in silver gray, and the wind carried a sharp, damp chill. The sleek black car glided smoothly across the pavement, leaving behind the noisy, restless city of Chicago. Julia sat in the back seat, her hands neatly folded over her purse. The business card Jacob had once given her still lay inside a mark she could not erase. After many sleepless nights, she had agreed to his proposal to become Ethan's private tutor. The decision left her both trembling and strangely eager, like stepping onto a bridge without knowing where the other side lay. As the car turned onto a stone-paved private road, Julia caught sight of towering iron gates, their intricate patterns as cold as chains. Security cameras followed the car's every move. The gates opened with a heavy metallic groan, revealing what lay beyond. The mansion emerged like a painting, drawn with equal parts power and solitude. The sprawling white building bore the grandeur of old European architecture. Soaring windows reflected the waning light. Stone columns stood like solemn guards, and the manicured gardens exuded a sense of absolute control. Even each branch seemed pruned to perfection. Julia swallowed hard, and part of her was awed by the beauty. Another part shivered what was such splendor hiding. Ethan was the first to greet her. The boy dressed in a gray sweater ran down the steps, his blue eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Miss Julia?" He flung his small arms around her waist, and Julia's tension dissolved just a little in that moment. His warm, childlike, and sincere embrace was a fragile light in the heavy atmosphere. "Ethan, calm down!" Jacob's voice called from the top of the steps. He descended with his usual commanding presence, though it softened slightly when his gaze rested on his son. Julia looked up. Today Jacob wore a charcoal suit, his tie loosened. He appeared less distant than he had at the hotel. He nodded in greeting, his eyes lingering on her longer than they should have. "Welcome to my home," he said. Such simple words, yet to Julia, they sounded like a contract. From this moment, she had crossed into his world. Inside the mansion was so vast that Julia felt swallowed whole. High ceilings crowned with chandeliers, polished wooden floors, reflecting each step oil paintings in gilded frames staring down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her. But what unsettled her most were not the luxuries. It was the men in discreet suits stationed at strategic points near the stairwell, by the tall windows at the end of corridors. They stood as still as statues, yet their sharp eyes cut like knives. Ethan tugged Julia's hand, pulling her toward the library. "I want you to see Papa's books." The wooden doors swung open, revealing a room that could awe any lover of literature. Towering shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes and rare editions. Light streamed through a grand window, dust motes sparkling like mist. Julia brushed her fingers over the spine of an old philosophy book, her hands trembling slightly with awe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Papa says books let us see what others try to hide." Ethan replied casually, as though quoting his father. Julia turned toward him. For a 6-year-old to say such things, it was unusual. And in that instant, she felt the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. The first lesson took place at the long table in the library. Julia prepared simple math games, but Ethan surprised her by carrying over a book in Italian. "I want you to read to me." Julia hesitated. She knew only a little Italian, enough to piece together sentences, but far from fluent. Slowly, haltingly, she began to read. Ethan listened intently, his eyes wide. At that moment, Jacob entered. He stood silently at the doorway, his gaze fixed on Julia. The room seemed to be still. When she finished a passage, his voice cut through the quiet. "Your pronunciation is not bad." Julia startled, her face flushing. "I only know a little." Jacob approached, taking the book gently from her hands, and continued reading in Italian. His deep voice rolled smoothly, resonant, each word flowing with ease. The rhythm was strong, yet tender, making the foreign syllables melt into the air. Ethan listened, enraptured. Julia, too, found herself stilled. She never imagined a man with such a dangerous aura could read with such gentleness. When he stopped, their eyes met. Julia looked away quickly, her heart pounding. Dinner in the grand hall followed. A long table clothed in white candles, flickering a 3-course meal arranged with elegance. Yet Julia felt out of place. The servants moved precisely, not a sound wasted, everything too perfect and distant. Ethan chattered about school, and Jacob listened and responded with brief words. Yet now and then his eyes returned to Julia. It was not a gaze heavy with desire, but one that studied, tinged with curiosity, he could not conceal. "My son needs someone like you," he said suddenly near the end of the meal. Julia looked up, startled. "Not just because he needs to learn," Jacob continued, "but you remind him that people still care about him for who he is, not for the name Smith." Julia's heart tightened. She did not answer, only nodded slightly, though something strange stirred within her chest. That night, Julia was given a guest room. It was larger than her entire Chicago apartment. A 4-poster bed in pristine sheets, a balcony opening to Lake Michigan glimmering under moonlight. She stood on the balcony alone. The wind swept through her hair, carrying the salty breath of the water. She spotted guards patrolling the grounds from afar. Silent shadows drifting across the estate. A shiver crept over her. This was not just a mansion. It was a fortress. The balcony door opened softly. Julia turned, her heart stalling as Jacob stepped inside. He no longer wore his suit, only a white shirt with undone top buttons. The golden lamplight carved out the hard lines of his face. "Am I disturbing you?" His voice was low, roughened slightly. Julia shook her head. I'm not used to this kind of silence." Jacob stepped closer, resting a hand on the railing, the distance between them little more than a breath. "Silence doesn't always mean safety," he said, his gaze drifting over the lake. "There are always things outside waiting for a way in." Julia studied his profile, catching the tension beneath his composure. Words slipped from her lips before she could stop them. "Then, how do you protect Ethan?" Jacob turned, his blue eyes burning in the night. "At any cost." His reply was firm, a vow carved in stone. Julia's chest tightened. Part of her was shaken by the fierce conviction, another part by the danger that seemed to cloak him, danger that threatened to sweep away the fragile peace she clung to. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, silencing her. In that moment, Julia felt herself caught between two worlds, the simple safety of her old life and this man's dark, compelling gravity. And she did not know why she didn't step back. When Jacob finally left, Julia remained on the balcony. The night wind was biting cold, but her heart burned hot. She knew that since the moment she crossed those iron gates, she was no longer just Julia Thompson, the elementary school teacher. She had become part of Jacob Smith's story. And deep inside, Julia sensed it would not be easy to escape. Mornings at the Smith estate were unlike any place Julia had ever known. When she opened her eyes, no honking cars or hurried footsteps echoed through an apartment hallway. Instead, there was birdsong carried from afar, and the gentle wash of light slipping through sheer white curtains. Beyond, Lake Michigan shimmered like a vast mirror, casting a peaceful and strangely unsettling serenity. Julia slipped on a coat and descended the staircase. Ethan was already seated in the vast dining hall, a bowl of cereal before him, as he animatedly recounted a dream to the elderly butler. Watching him, Julia felt her heart lighten. Ethan's innocence was the only warmth that softened the cold grandeur of the mansion. Jacob appeared soon after, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, his tie knotted neatly. He took his seat at the head of the table, giving Julia a brief nod, almost as if the gesture had become a new habit. "Good morning," Julia answered softly. "Good morning, Mr. Smith." His eyes flicked toward her, a glint of something unreadable flashing through them. "Call me Jacob." A simple remark, but it unsettled Julia. She nodded, continuing her breakfast in silence. Though inside, she felt something shift the distance between them, narrowing in a way she had not expected. That day's lesson with Ethan occurred in the gardens behind the mansion. Julia had brought along letter cards to turn learning into a playful game. Ethan laughed brightly, running across the lawn, his hair flying in the sun. "Miss Julia, come on," he shouted, reaching out as if to pull her into his joy. Julia laughed, letting go of her usual seriousness. For a fleeting moment, she forgot she was inside the fortress of a powerful man. It was just her, a 6-year-old boy, and sunlight streaming through leaves. But the fragile peace was shattered by the growl of engines in the distance. A black SUV tore into the garden, halting abruptly. 4 strangers stepped out, coats, long eyes sharp as blades. Julia froze, pulling Ethan into her arms. "Who are you?" Before fear could crest, the estate's guards appeared, their handguns glinting in the sun. The air tightened, a bowstring drawn to breaking. One of the men stepped forward, his voice firm. "We want to see Jacob Smith. Tell him this is no longer a game in the shadows." Julia's blood ran cold. Rumors of Jacob's underworld connections suddenly took shape before her eyes. Just as tension suffocated the garden, Jacob appeared from the stone path. He carried no weapon, his calm bearing more striking than any show of force. "You dare set foot here?" His voice was low, but it stilled the entire garden. "I thought my warning was clear enough." The intruder sneered, replying in words Julia couldn't fully grasp, except for one name that sliced through the air. "Romano." At that, the atmosphere grew heavier still. Jacob took a step forward, his eyes like blades. "Leave, while I still allow you to walk away alive." A tense silence. Then slowly the men retreated, slipping back into their SUV. Tires screeched against stone, and the car vanished behind the trees. Julia clutched Ethan tighter, her heart pounding. When Jacob turned back, his gaze found hers. For a breathless moment, they stared at one another. In his eyes, she saw anger and a flicker of worry for her. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. The cold faces of the intruders and the veiled threat in their words made her realize that stepping into this mansion meant stepping into the crosshairs of unseen forces. A soft knock broke her restless thoughts. She opened the door to find Jacob standing there, no longer in his immaculate suit, but in a shirt with the collar undone. The hall light cast his face in weary lines, the scar at his temple half shrouded in shadow. "Am I disturbing you?" His voice was lower than usual, almost roughened by fatigue. Julia shook her head. "I can't sleep." Jacob entered, moving to the window. His tall figure loomed against the white curtains, half lit, half veiled. "I suppose you've seen part of why I need someone trustworthy besides Ethan," he said, voice gravelly. "My enemies will stop at nothing. And now, because you are here, you too will be a target." Julia's heart clenched. "Then why let me stay?" Jacob turned, his blue eyes fierce, yet tinged with something gentler, something fragile. "Because you are the only one who makes Ethan feel safe. And..." He paused, his voice dipping as if it wavered. "I don't want to lose that." A current surged through Julia. It wasn't fear. It wasn't coercion. It was achingly honest, delicate, pulling her into the depths of his gaze. Neither spoke further. Only the ticking of the clock filled the silence. Julia became acutely aware of how close they stood, close enough to hear her own heartbeat hammering. Jacob leaned slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. For an instant, his lips hovered so near, she thought a breath might erase the space between them. But he stopped, glancing away. "I shouldn't do this." His voice was low, husky with restraint. Julia's chest tightened. Half of her was relieved he had stopped. The other half ached with disappointment. When Jacob left, Julia sank onto the edge of the bed. She touched her lips unconsciously, the echo of his gaze still burning. A truth rose within her, undeniable. She had begun to feel something. But she also knew this feeling was more dangerous than anything else. It was like a flame sparked in the heart of a storm, bright, intoxicating, yet easily extinguished. That night, Julia lay awake until dawn crept over the lake. Outside the Smith estate remained lit and guarded a fortress that never slept. And within her heart, a new battle had begun. The next morning, Julia woke with a heavy heart. She had barely slept, haunted by the conflicting images of Jacob's gaze, fierce yet tender, burning in her mind. She stepped onto the balcony and watched the morning sun spread across the lake. The view was so peaceful, it was hard to believe that just the day before, violence had swept through the garden like an unseen storm. A soft knock startled her. She opened the door to find Ethan clutching a book tightly in his arms. "Miss Julia, will you read with me today?" he asked, smiling brightly, as if the world beyond these walls had never known darkness. Julia nodded, smiling back. That innocent moment soothed her heart. Yet she couldn't help but think Ethan's smile was being held up by the iron walls his father had built. And walls, no matter how high, could always fall. In the study, Jacob was speaking with Antonio with his right hand. Their voices were low but tense. Julia hadn't meant to overhear as she passed, but certain words slipped through. Romano, Chicago, betrayal. Her chest tightened. She didn't understand everything, but felt it clearly. A new danger was coming, greater than the men who stormed the garden yesterday. Jacob noticed her and gestured for Antonio to leave. He stepped closer, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Julia, I need to talk to you." Bathed in the soft yellow glow of the study, he sat in a leather chair. Fingers interlocked, his brow deeply furrowed. "Those men yesterday weren't just issuing a warning. They represent Romano, a rival family that has long stood against me in the shadows. Now they want to claim my territory." Julia clenched her fists. "But why drag Ethan and me into this?" Jacob held her gaze, his eyes both unyielding and strangely vulnerable. "Because I let you in, and Romano will not spare anything or anyone that could break me." The air thickened. Julia wanted to argue, push him away, and re-establish the distance between them. But her heart trembled at the truth of his words. She, an outsider, had become a weakness his enemies could exploit. That afternoon, Julia took Ethan for a walk around the estate. The boy chattered about dreams about an old kite he once saw in a toy shop window. Julia smiled silently, promising to bring him such rare joys. Suddenly, she noticed a figure beyond the iron fence, a thin man in a cap holding up a phone. The camera flash blinked. Julia immediately pulled Ethan back, her heart hammering. The man vanished into the trees so quickly, it was as if he had never been there. "What happened?" Miss Julia Ethan asked, puzzled. "Nothing. It's nothing." She reassured him, though inside she knew Romano was watching already, even inside what seemed an impregnable fortress. That night she told Jacob. He didn't look surprised, only nodded as if he had anticipated it. "They'll try everything. You must be prepared." Julia's chest tightened. "And how do you intend to protect me? Lock me in a room, surround me with guards. I'm not a prisoner." Jacob frowned slightly. Julia saw helplessness flicker in those cold blue eyes for the first time. "I don't want you to be a prisoner. But more than anything, I don't want to see you hurt." His words shook her. Beneath the iron exterior, Jacob carried a hidden fear, the fear of losing those he loved. That night, Julia lay awake, rain tapping against the windows. It carried her back to the first evening she met Ethan, shivering, lost in the storm. If she had ignored that cry, what would her life be like? Perhaps still her cramped apartment, her modest paycheck, a quiet existence. Yet she would not be lying here torn between fear and the ache she felt whenever Jacob looked at her. Near midnight, a strange sound jolted her. The window rattled curtains, whipping wildly. But it wasn't the wind. A shadow moved outside the terrace. Before she could react, her door burst open. Jacob stood there, a handgun steady in his grip, his eyes sharp. "Come with me," he ordered quietly, leaving no room for questions. The hallway was dim, and guards rushed to check every door and window. Jacob led her swiftly to the basement, her first glimpse of the estate's intricate security systems. In the safe room, Julia clutched a sleeping Ethan to her chest, her pulse racing. Jacob stood by the door, speaking into a radio with Antonio, his voice rough. "Romano sent men inside. No one gets past this line." Julia watched him in silence. Jacob was not a billionaire or a shadowed power broker at that moment. He was a father willing to risk everything standing on the line between life and death to protect what he loved. And Julia realized her heart already belonged to him. No matter how her mind screamed, it was a mistake her feelings had crossed a line beyond control. When the threat finally subsided at dawn, Julia sat in the safe room, still holding Ethan's small hand. Jacob entered, his shirt dusted with grime, a scratch bleeding lightly on his arm. Julia leapt up. "You're hurt!" He waved it off. "It's nothing." But when her worried eyes met his, he couldn't hide it any longer. Jacob was no longer a wall of steel. For the first time, he was flesh and blood, vulnerable, capable of bleeding and falling. Julia fetched a clean cloth and gently dabbed at his wound. Her movements were slow, tender. Jacob said nothing, only watched her. His eyes softened, hard edges melting into something more profound, unspoken. "Julia," he murmured her name, breaking the silence, his voice husky, dissolving in the small space. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Time seemed to stop. His breath was close, familiar, making her heart stumble. Unable to resist, Jacob lifted her chin. The space between them vanished. His kiss was fierce, unrestrained, the flood of everything he had held back. Julia trembled, then yielded. Outside storms might rage, but here in the safe room, only two hearts beat as one. When they finally parted, Jacob's eyes still burned alight like embers fed at last. He whispered, "I can't keep my distance anymore. You've stepped into my life, Julia. And there's no way back." Julia pressed her hand against his chest, feeling his heart thunder beneath her palm. She knew the road ahead was fraught with peril. Yet perhaps within that danger, she had found what she had never known, a love fierce, fragile, and powerful enough to change everything. Morning sunlight filtered through the thick glass bathing the Smith mansion's living room in a warm golden hue. But the atmosphere inside was far from peaceful. Julia sat by the old piano, her fingers brushing lightly across the keys as if seeking solace. The scattered notes rose and fell, fragile and uneven like her heart. She had only just begun to open it, yet already danger loomed. The door creaked open. Ethan bounded in, carrying the small puppy he had just been given. "Miss Julia, will you listen to me play?" he asked eagerly. setting the dog down before climbing onto the bench, his little hands striking the keys with playful randomness. Julia laughed, her tension softening. But then she noticed Jacob leaning against the doorway, his eyes fixed on her every movement. That look unsettled her. Since their kiss the night before, the distance between them had shifted. Something was now trembling yet undeniable between them, an invisible thread binding them together. But Julia knew this was no simple affection. It was entwined with danger, with enemies waiting just beyond the walls. That afternoon, Julia insisted on leaving the mansion to visit her old school, Lincoln Elementary. She needed to see for herself to know whether Romano had truly extended his reach to the small, fragile lives there. Jacob resisted at first, but at her pleading, he relented, assigning Antonio and 2 guards to accompany her. The familiar streets unfolded beyond the car windows, but to Julia, they looked altered. The cracked corners, the graffiti-smeared walls once familiar, now seemed marked with the sense of being watched. When the car stopped, Julia stepped out, inhaling deeply. The school was alive with the chatter of children. Former colleagues crowded around her in surprise, showering her with questions. Julia smiled, though unease gnawed at her heart. Then she saw him. A man is sitting in the cafe across the street. He wasn't eating or drinking, just staring at the schoolyard. And Julia swore he was the same man who had taken photographs near the estate days earlier. Her pulse quickened. Romano was no longer a distant name. They were here, close, silent, inevitable. That evening, Jacob entered his study where Julia was waiting. She recounted everything she had seen. He listened in silence, his eyes darkening. "I knew it was only a matter of time," he said at last. His voice rough. "Romano doesn't just want land or money. They want to break me from the inside out." "But," Julia faltered, "what about the school? The children?" Jacob looked up, his blue eyes flaring. "If necessary, I'll protect the whole city, Julia. But I cannot be everywhere at once." The words were both cold and sorrowful. Julia felt the crushing weight he carried, not just as a father, a billionaire, and as the axis of endless unseen wars. For a fleeting moment, she longed to step forward to hold him and share that burden. But when their eyes met, she faltered. Their feelings had already crossed the line of safety. But could she endure the road ahead? Julia woke to a faint sound that night, the soft tap against her window. She pulled back the curtain, and her heart clenched. A white envelope was tucked beneath the frame. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside, a single sheet hastily scrawled, "Leave him before it's too late. Next time it won't just be a warning." Julia froze. The words cut deep. Romano was no longer hiding. They knew about her, the only woman aside from Ethan in Jacob's life. Her palms went cold with sweat. In that moment, Julia understood she was no longer a bystander. She had become a target. The next morning, Julia showed Jacob the letter. His eyes burned with fury as he read it. "I'll take care of this." "But they're coming after me," Julia whispered, trembling. "You can't deny it." Jacob crushed the paper in his fist as though he could grind the thread into dust. "That's precisely why I warned you. Julia, you still have a chance to walk away to escape all of this. But if you stay, there will be no turning back." Her chest tightened. To leave meant leaving Ethan, leaving Jacob's piercing yet tender gaze. But to stay meant placing her very life upon a dangerous board. "I don't know," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Jacob stepped forward and grasped her hand. For the first time, he didn't look invincible. His voice dropped low, rough with emotion. "I don't know if I can protect everything either. But I know one thing, Julia, I cannot lose you." His words pulled her heart closer, an invisible cord drawing her in. She realized then, beyond the power, beyond the shadows and enemies, Jacob longed not for victory, but for the fragile safety of those he loved. The day dragged heavily with dread. Julia hid in the mansion's library, seeking refuge in books. Yet even there she felt eyes on her, not the guards, but invisible ones lurking, waiting. As dusk fell, Antonio appeared, his face tight with urgency. "Jacob wants you in the safe room. Now." Julia's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "Romano left a gift at the main gate. A box. Inside was a bullet with your name carved on it." Julia staggered, knees weak. Romano's message was no longer veiled. No more whispers, no subtle threats. Her name was etched into violence itself. When Antonio led her down, Jacob was waiting in the steel room, his eyes storming with rage. He stepped forward, gripping her shoulders with trembling restraint. "I swear they will not touch you, Julia. Not as long as I live, whatever the cost." In that moment, Julia understood. The battle was no longer just Jacob's. She had been pulled into the storm's eye. And from here, there was only one path left to face it. Inside the safe room, Julia was still trembling. The bullet engraved with her name lay inside a small wooden box on the table, cold and haunting. Every time the light caught the surface of the metal, she felt as though death itself was quietly lurking in the room. Jacob sat at the head of the table, hands clasped, eyes half closed. His silence stretched on so long that Julia could not tell whether he was deep in thought or suppressing a fury too dangerous to unleash. Antonio and Enzo stood nearby, their faces grim, barely daring to breathe. "What does Romano want?" Julia finally asked, her voice raw with anxiety. Jacob opened his eyes. His deep blue gaze was like an abyss glinting with an icy edge. "He wants me to kneel, and he thinks he can achieve that by going after you." Julia clenched her hands to steady herself. "So what will you do?" Jacob fixed his eyes on her. "I'll meet him." The room froze. Antonio immediately protested. "It's a trap. Romano won't come to negotiate." Jacob gave a slow nod, the corner of his mouth curling into a sardonic smile. "I know, but if I don't show up, he'll keep pushing. This time it's a bullet. Next time it could be blood." Julia's chest felt heavy as though stones were pressing down on her. Part of her wanted to scream to stop him, but another part knew the truth. This was not a battle they could evade. Romano had called her name, and Jacob had no choice but to confront him. The next day, Julia found Jacob alone in the grand library. He sat in a leather chair holding a glass of whiskey, but barely drinking. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching on the strands of silver in his hair. She walked closer and sat beside him. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. Jacob tilted his head slightly, looking at her. "Men like me don't have the right to show fear, but..." He paused, his voice husky. "Some things don't let me remain calm." Julia waited in silence. "Before, when Romano targeted me, I didn't care. But when he turned to Ethan, and to you..." Jacob's voice tightened, his eyes blazing with intensity. "That's something I will never allow." Julia's throat tightened. His pride came from power or wealth and the fierce desire to protect what he loved. And now she realized she had been drawn into that circle. "Jacob." She whispered his name for the first time without distance. His gaze caught hers, striking a spark in her chest. Amid the darkness and danger, something fierce surged between them. Love. He reached for her hand, gripping it firmly. "I won't let you go, even if Romano unleashes the entire world against me." In that moment, Julia knew there was no going back. She had stepped too far, and the only path left was forward with him. 2 days later, the meeting with Romano occurred in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago. Julia hadn't wanted to go, but Jacob unexpectedly insisted she come. "Why?" she asked, stunned. "Because Romano needs to see that I'm not afraid. And because..." Jacob lowered his voice, brushing his hand gently against her cheek. "I want him to know that if he touches you, I'll turn his entire family to ashes." Julia was speechless. Her mind told her to refuse, but her heart knew if this was the turning point, she had to witness it. The armored car rolled slowly down a desolate road, lined with decaying warehouses. When it stopped, Julia's heart clenched. Romano was already waiting, flanked by his men. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and eyes as sharp as blades. A faint smile tugged at his lips, half disdain, half triumph. "Jacob Smith," he said, savoring each word. "So you finally step out of your fortress." Jacob gave no reply, only pulled Julia closer to his side, a silent declaration. Romano's gaze slid toward Julia, his smile widening. "Ah, the woman who makes you vulnerable. Beautiful indeed. But beauty in this game saves no one." Goosebumps prickled Julia's skin, but she held her head high, refusing to flinch under his stare. Jacob stepped forward, his voice a low growl, each word edged like steel. "If you touch her so much, it will be your last mistake." Romano laughed, the sound echoing through the warehouse. Do you think I haven't heard threats like that before from how many men, and where are they now in the ground? The air was taut as a bowstring. Weapons shifted in men's hands. Julia's breath caught painfully in her chest. Romano stepped closer, his voice dropping like venom. I don't want war. I only want a few pieces of land, a slice of profit. In return, she lives. Julia froze. He spoke of her as if she were a bargaining chip. Rage flared in her chest, but Jacob squeezed her hand tightly. Before she could speak, she is not part of your negotiations, Jacob said coldly. And I won't give you a single inch. Romano's expression darkened. His smile vanished, replaced with venom. He gestured sharply. At once, more men emerged from the shadows surrounding them. Julia's lungs seized. This was a trap, but Jacob didn't waver. He drew his gun with steady precision, his eyes blazing like fire. Then let's see Romano. Who goes into the ground first? In that suffocating moment, Julia suddenly stepped forward, her eyes locked on Romano. She didn't know why. Perhaps she refused to remain only in the background. Mr. Romano, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You can threaten, you can unleash violence, but you'll never win what you don't understand. Romano raised an eyebrow, startled. What did you say? Julia's grip tightened as she continued. You have power, you have men, but Jacob has something you will never possess: true loyalty. You can buy obedience, but you cannot buy hearts. Silence fell. Romano's eyes flashed with irritation, but Jacob's hand squeezed hers in silent approval. At that moment, Julia realized she was no longer just an outsider. She had stepped onto the board, and her voice could alter the game. The meeting ended, not in blood, but in a poisonous truce. Romano withdrew for now, though his eyes promised he would return. On the way back, Julia sat beside Jacob, her head leaning lightly against the window. Her heart still pounded, but beneath it pulsed a strange, newfound strength. She had faced the darkness and survived. Jacob turned to her, his eyes no longer stormy, but softened with rare warmth. His voice was low, meant only for her. Julia, today you reminded me that not every battle requires bullets. She met his gaze and smiled, faintly weary, but resolute. And you, Jacob, made me believe there are things worth risking. In the armored car speeding into the night, their hands found each other and held tight. Outside, shadows still lingered. But inside, a flame burned bright, a fire no enemy could extinguish. The armored car brought Julia and Jacob to the mansion just before midnight. Neither of them spoke the entire ride. Julia sat silently, her hand enclosed in Jacob's, feeling his warmth and strength and sensing the heavy weight that refused to lift. The encounter with Romano had not been an end. It was only the opening act to a far bloodier confrontation. When the car stopped, Ethan was already asleep in the old butler's arms. Julia bent down to gently kiss the boy's forehead, her heart aching. The child had no idea that a storm was gathering all around him. Jacob stood nearby, quietly observing. He said nothing, but they softened when his eyes rested on Julia as she leaned over Ethan. That gaze carried something Julia dared not name. It was too deep, absolute, and dangerous to admit. In the following days, the atmosphere inside the mansion grew suffocating. Security doubled windows were replaced with bulletproof glass, and the fences were reinforced with electrified wiring. Yet Julia knew all of it was an illusion of safety. Romano would not retreat. He was merely waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, Julia found Jacob in the training room, his shirt soaked with sweat as his fists slammed again and again into a heavy bag. The sound reverberated through the walls, the raw violence of a man caging his fury. She stepped inside, her voice tentative. Jacob. He stopped, his breathing ragged, his eyes still cold and sharp. But when he raised, the storm in his gaze quieted, if only a little. You shouldn't be here, he said hoarsely. I don't want to hide anymore, Julia replied, stepping closer. I want to stand by you, even if it means facing all the danger with you. Jacob stared at her for a long moment. Then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. His breath was hot against her ear, his voice raw, almost a confession. You don't understand, Julia. The closer you are to me, the deeper you're pulled into the abyss. But I can't push you away anymore. Julia buried her face against his chest, feeling his heart pounding. In that moment, she realized she no longer wanted to turn back. But peace, brief as it was, shattered quickly. 2 days later, Antonio brought the news. One of Jacob's warehouses at the docks had exploded. Flames roared into the night like a monstrous torch, thick black smoke curling into the sky. Julia saw the footage on the security feed, her heart seizing. Were there casualties? Antonio's voice dropped. Some of our men didn't make it out. Jacob said nothing. He stood motionless, his blue eyes gleaming with a cold, unyielding fire. Julia knew that beneath that silence was a storm about to break loose. That night, Jacob left the mansion to go to the docks himself. Julia couldn't bear to stay behind. She followed him. The area still smoldered smoke, stinging the air with the acrid scent of fire. Bodies lay along the pier covered in white sheets, and the sight froze Julia's blood. Jacob stood at the waterfront, the wind whipping his coat. He shed no tears, but his fists clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. Julia approached gently, laying a hand on his shoulder. He turned to her, and for the first time she saw raw, unguarded pain in his eyes. He said, "Romano has declared real war," his voice a deep rasp. "And he won't stop until one of us falls." Julia shivered. In that moment, she knew her feelings for Jacob had surpassed fear. Not because he was powerful, not because he was wealthy, but because beneath it all, he was a man she wanted to stand beside, whether in flames or in ashes. A few days later, Romano struck again. This time, he didn't target warehouses. He went after Jacob's weakest point, Ethan. While Julia walked Ethan through the garden one afternoon, a strange drone zipped overhead and dropped an envelope before them. Julia snatched Ethan back, her heart constricting. Inside the envelope was a photograph of Ethan asleep in his bedroom, captured from the angle of a hidden camera. Beneath the photo was a single line, "Nowhere is safe. Surrender everything or lose everything." Julia's hands shook as she clutched Ethan tightly. The boy looked up, puzzled, unaware. But Julia knew this was no longer a warning, it was proof. Romano had infiltrated the most private corner of their lives. When Jacob saw the photo, veins bulged at his temples. He slammed it down onto the table, his voice thunderous. "He's gone too far." Julia stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Then let me stand with you. I don't want to hide behind you anymore." Jacob looked at her, and for the first time he didn't refuse. He gave a slight, solemn nod. "Then from now on, Julia, you are not just someone I want to protect. You're the one I need beside me in this fight." That night, rain lashed the windows. Julia couldn't sleep. She stepped onto the balcony, staring at the blurred outline of Lake Michigan through the downpour. A moment later, Jacob appeared, draped in a thin coat, standing beside her silently. "Do you ever wish?" Julia asked quietly. "Were you just an ordinary man?" Jacob let out a bitter, low laugh. "If I were ordinary, would you still be here with me?" Julia turned to him. His eyes were no longer cold, but unguarded, fragile. She lifted her hand to his cheek. "I would still be here. Not for money. Not for power, just for you." In that instant, Jacob pulled her into his arms, his kiss fierce with hunger and despair. It wasn't only love, a vow forged in the storm, that even if tomorrow brought ruin tonight, they would belong to each other. Julia kissed him back, tears mingling with the rain. She knew she had chosen a path with no way back. But if it meant stepping into the fire with Jacob, she would not hesitate. When they finally broke apart, Jacob whispered against her ear, "Tomorrow, Romano will have my answer. Not in words, but in blood." Julia leaned against his chest, closing her eyes. Fear churned inside her, yet alongside it burned a strange, unshakable faith. Their love was a flame, and it had the power to burn away the night. The night sky over Chicago was shrouded in thick clouds, thunder rumbling in the distance, like a warning of the storm to come. The Smith mansion blazed with light, but Julia knew no brightness could disguise the undercurrent of chaos swelling beneath the surface. Jacob had summoned all his most loyal men. Romano was no longer content with threats. He had infiltrated their world, spread fear, even carved Julia's name onto a bullet. And now there was no other path left but confrontation. Julia stood in the library, her hand brushing the spines of old books. Outside, footsteps echoed. Weapons were checked, each sound pounding like a war drum. Her heart beat just as fiercely in her chest. Jacob entered, towering in the warm glow of the lamps. He wore a black shirt beneath a long coat. His hair damp from the rain, his face carved with weariness, yet his eyes blazed like fire. "Tonight it ends," he said, his voice low and resolute. Julia's breath caught. And if you don't come back? His brows furrowed slightly as he stepped closer, his warm hands clasping her shoulders. Julia, I've spent my entire life walking in the dark, but for the first time, I have a reason to return. That reason is you. Her tears spilled hot and unstoppable. She buried her face in his chest, whispering in a trembling voice, Then promise me, you'll come back. Jacob bent down, pressing a long kiss into her hair. I promise. The harbor lay deserted beneath the rain. Faded yellow lights spilled from old lampposts, glimmering across the wet pavement. Romano was already waiting, flanked by more than a dozen armed men. He wore a long coat, a cigar glowing red between his fingers, his smirk steeped in arrogance. Jacob Smith. Romano's voice boomed across the docks. I knew you wouldn't hide tonight. Jacob stepped forward unhurried with only a handful of trusted men behind him. Julia, despite his protests, had come as well. She knew if this was their day of destiny, she could not turn away. Romano's eyes lit up when he noticed her. Ah, your woman has joined you. How touching. But I'm afraid tonight she'll weep. Jacob moved to shield Julia, his voice sharp as a blade. Romano, tonight only one of us walks away. Gunfire erupted, tearing through the night. Muzzles flashed like lightning. The battle broke out with the fury of steel and storm. Julia crouched behind a crate, her heart hammering every shot like thunder in her ears. At the center, Jacob fought with a lethal grace, his tall figure cutting through smoke and chaos. Every shot he fired, every move he made was precise, relentless, as if his whole life had been leading to this night. But Romano was no easy prey. He hid behind containers, his shots aimed only for Jacob. Julia could do nothing but watch her chest tightening. Suddenly, a shadow lunged at Jacob from behind a knife glinting in the rain. Jacob! Julia screamed. He spun, dropping the attacker, but in that instant, Romano raised his gun. The crack of a shot split the night, the bullet screaming forward. Julia didn't think. By instinct alone, she hurled herself at Jacob, pushing him aside. Pain seared through her shoulder as the bullet pierced flesh. She collapsed, hot blood soaking her blouse, spreading red in the rain. Jacob roared, dropping to cradle her. For the first time, sheer terror ripped across his face. Romano laughed, stepping forward, gun still aimed. Do you see now? One bullet and all your power crumbles. Jacob laid Julia down gently, then rose. Fire blazed in his eyes as he leveled his gun. You were wrong, Romano. She doesn't weaken me. She makes me stronger. The final shot rang out, echoing into the storm. Romano staggered, the cigar falling dead to the wet ground before his body followed. His men scattered into the shadows. The battle was over. Julia was rushed back to the mansion that very night. The bullet had torn through her shoulder, but missed anything fatal. When the doctor left, the room was quiet. Only Jacob and Julia remained. He sat at her bedside, his hands trembling as he clutched hers. Why? Why did you do that? His voice was hoarse, his eyes red with fury and fear. You nearly died. Julia smiled faintly, her voice as soft as breath. Because I couldn't watch you fall. Because I love you. Her words cut him open and healed him all at once. Jacob bent down, pressing his lips to hers in a desperate and tender kiss, filled with every truth he had buried. I love you too, Julia, he whispered. I have for a long time. Tears slid down her cheeks, but now they were tears of joy. Weeks later, when her wounds had healed, Julia sat by the garden lake with Ethan, watching him laugh as he flew a small kite high into the sky. Peace, fragile and rare, settled over the air. Jacob approached from behind, draping a coat over her shoulders. Once heavy with storms, his eyes now glowed with a rare serenity. It's over, he said, his voice low but softened. Julia looked up at him, a gentle smile on her lips. No, Jacob. This is just the beginning. He nodded, wrapping his arms around her. Above them, Ethan's kite soared, a symbol of a future not bound by shadows, but touched by light. In that moment, Julia knew their love, tempered by blood fire and darkness, had become unbreakable. If you too believe in a love that dares to challenge destiny, follow this channel to discover more stories of passion and resilience. where hearts always find their way, even through the deepest dark.